Hello and welcome to Curator with a Camera. I'm Anthony Coulls, Senior Curator at the National Railway Museum, and we're here in New Hall at Locomotion to have a look at the motor rail Simplex locomotive. The Simplex locomotive is born out of innovation. It was made by the Motor Rail and Tramcar Company in 1931, and the trade name that they operated under was Simplex because the locomotive was simple. The Motor Rail and Tramcar Company was making gearboxes initially, and their proprietor, John Dixon Abbott, moved the company in 1916 to Bedford. That year they received a request from the War Department to build small petrol locomotives for use on the First World War trench railways running supplies to the front line. So the French military forces were running narrow gauge railways to take supplies to the front, and the War Department seized upon this idea and said, let's create some locomotives, some petrol locomotives to do that, because a steam locomotive gives away its location. By day, you've got smoke coming out of the top of it and it's quite noisy. By night, you see the glow from the fire and occasional sparks coming from the chimney, which gives it complete and utterly away to the enemy forces. So the Motor Rail and Tramcar Company came up with this idea of a small petrol locomotive, 4 wheels, 20 horsepower, easy to start, and the specification they came up with was accepted by the War Department, who ran the War Department Light Railways Division, and well over 800 locomotives were made in that period, operating all over the light railways for the First World War. So what does that have to do with this machine behind us, of course? Well, that's 1916, 1918, and the surplus, the war surplus of these locomotives, they start to find their way into civilian use. Quarries, mines, construction companies, the 2-foot gauge, narrow gauge railway becomes the thing that contractors use. Now, it doesn't take a huge amount of innovation to change the width of the axles and make the principle of the 2-foot gauge Simplex locomotive into a standard gauge machine. And there was the masterstroke of the Motor Rail and Tramcar Company. They changed their name ultimately to Simplex Mechanical Handling, but Motor Rail and Tramcar Company is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it, after all? The railways used horses shunting throughout their goods yards and small distribution depots, and the Simplex locomotive was sold on the premise that it was cheaper than a horse to run. You could start it when you wanted it to move a wagon, you could shut it down, and of course a horse has to be fed, it has to be watered, it has to be given time to rest, and it's quite often said that to do the work of one horse you need 3 horses. So that's quite an investment. So you have 1 horse doing the work, you have another horse resting, and you have a 3rd horse in case either of those are unwell. And therefore a Simplex locomotive was seen as being an investment, a petrol-powered shunting horse, as it were. And therefore the mainline railways began to take on the option as well. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway had them. Various constituents of the Southern Railway had them. The London South Western Railway, the Great Western Railway, all began to experiment with Simplex locomotives and initially began to supplant the shunting horse with these machines. That's enough of the history of our Simplex. Looks a bit like a potting shed on wheels, and it's quite unlike any other loco in our collection. So let's go and see how it works. The Simplex loco is simplicity itself. From the wooden buffer beam through to these cast ends on each end. In essence, it is a motorised rail wagon, and those cast ends give it the adhesion, give it the weight that it needs to be able to move 1 or 2 wagons at a time. It's not there to be in use throughout the day. It's there when they want it. They turn it on, they turn it off. But of course, how do you turn it on? The entertainment with this, of course, there's no electric start with these. So here is the hole in the side of the frames where you would put a starting handle in, not quite like the GoPro handle, and then you would turn it over like that, and start the engine through the gearbox there. So no ignition keys, nothing posh or fancy at all, just dead simple. Look at it. You have very little protection for the driver. There would actually be a couple of pieces of sheet steel over these hatches, these empty hatches, but very, very simple. Single roof. There's the exhaust pipe going up to the top of the engine, and on the roof there itself the exhaust and silencer. And on this side we can see here the petrol tank, the fuel tank. I think it's something like 26 gallons on a Simplex, and then handbrake there, driver's seat, this is the back of it, we'll go and see the other side in a minute, and then the radiator. So the radiator is there to cool down or keep the petrol engine cool whilst it's in operation, so you don't get it overheating, problems of seizing up and all sorts. Bear in mind, this is a very straightforward machine, but right at the beginning of the internal combustion locomotive in common use. So whilst people have been investigating and innovating and trying out diesel and petrol shunting locomotives since the end of the 19th century, this is in common use. And again, look at that, the wooden windows on the end of it. It is almost like a greenhouse, isn't it? It's very, very simple. Just wood and iron and steel. No fripperies, no attention to detail, just a thing to do a job. Simple buffers, straightforward 3-link coupling, no air brakes, no vacuum brakes, just a machine to move wagons around in a yard, at a depot, at an oil refinery. And it's a 4-wheel machine. It's a 4-wheel petrol mechanical, and here underneath at the front we can see very clearly the drive chains coming out from the gearbox in the middle of the engine, round from the sprocket to this drive sprocket, drive gear on the axle, and there is exactly the same at the other end. So in wheel arrangement terms, it's a 4-wheel petrol mechanical, 4WPM if you want to see it in the books. And there also is a sandbox coming down with a sandpipe to the wheel, because of course adhesion is a really important thing for this thing to get its grip. Handbrake operated, we saw from the footplate or from the cab down to a brake block there on the wheel, and then the springing arrangement and the axle box on the end. Horrendously simple, very, very basic. And so here at the front of the locomotive is that radiator, and there behind, down there, is the top of the sandbox, the lid that comes off there. These radiators were the Davis pattern, and they were ones where you could take the individual elements out rather than have to replace the entire radiator. So if one of the tubes had a leak or perforated, you had a problem with it, you could take it out individually rather than having to replace the entire radiator. And that was one of Motor Rail's innovations. But what else? How do you drive the thing? We always ask that with Curator with a camera, and we've seen it in things like the 125, cutting edge technology. We've seen the Sentinel. Go and have a look at the Sentinel film where you see how easy it is to drive. This thing is easy, but it's not necessarily straightforward. However, you can learn to drive it in seconds. How do you drive it? Well, first off, driver comforts. There is the seat, the driver's seat. No padding, slight curvage there for the driver's posterior to be a little bit ergonomically designed. And the in-cab heating, well, is sitting on top of the bonnet for the engine. So you've got a radiator there, and then the engine itself is underneath this housing, underneath this bonnet. And it's a Dorman petrol engine. Dormans of Stafford made it, and they were pretty much synonymous with motor rail production for many, many years. The big hand brake stanchion, that is your only brake on this machine. And then 4 final controls. There is a hand throttle over there to control the speed of the engine. There's a clutch pedal here. There's the direction lever driving onto the gear, working onto the gearbox, and then there is the speed itself. There's actually two throttles. There's a throttle one duplicated on that side, and then this is the gear change lever, which has two speeds of slow and slower, because of course you're not wanting to tear things up, and you've probably got a top speed of about 10 miles an hour with this thing. And then steps to get the driver up. One of the challenges that was said to me when we were about to film this was good luck in getting up there to have a look at it. So I'll just demonstrate how it looks when somebody makes a fool of themselves getting onto this loco. There we are. Two other things that we forgot. We talked about the sandboxes, of course, on each end of the loco, dropping down to the driving wheels. And here are the controls for the sander. So if I want sand on the front of the engine, I put my foot on that one, and sand on at the back and go in the other direction, I put my foot on that one. So here we go. Let's have a seat and see just exactly how delightful it is to sit. Well, I don't want to be any taller, I'll tell you that. And yeah, shuffle myself to there. I have one foot control. Hello Jay, we can't help but get you in there. Foot control there on the clutch pedal. I've got the direction there and the gearbox there. There's a couple of chocks that people have left around, and a spare drive chain should we ever need one. I'm not entirely sure we shall ever get this one going, but nonetheless it's there if we need it. And the view that I have, handbrake of course, there. I'm not going to wind it off just in case we go anywhere, despite the fact that the rails here in Newhall are level. And yeah, there is our roof, right above my head. There is the exhaust coming up through the hole in the roof, and then it goes along, held in place by this bolt here, and the exhaust is on the top there. My driver's view is through those windows. So there, we're looking up across tank wagons and various other bits and pieces in Newhall. And then if I spin round once again, waving at Jay, yeah, right on cue, my view towards the end of Newhall, and there's Duncan, our sound guy. Also, big kudos to these guys. They work long and hard hours, not just making these films for you, but editing them and producing them as well. So really nice to give them their little bit of credit there. So yeah, there's our radiator. Would actually be driven by a pulley, a belt coming off that pulley there down to the engine, so that it is nice and kept nice and cool. That's not there anymore, and there's a missing piece of the floor there, but that's it. The Simplex is utilitarian, it's basic, and you could learn to drive it in seconds. Something like this must have been an absolute revelation for the crews who had to operate them. It does what it says on the tin. Simplex, simplicity, simple. Turn it on, turn it off, job done. Thanks for joining us today for Curator with a Camera. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, why not like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes.